And I didn't quite finish the lesson to my own satisfaction today. So tomorrow there will probably be an additional reading from the Brit Chadashah. I couldn't make up my mind. I was looking at 3 different texts, and sometimes I need to sleep on it. So I'm probably going to sleep on it tonight and then see what happens in the morning as far as the direction we'll take tomorrow to wrap this up, by looking at a couple more topics that I think are associated with it, because what we're doing right now, we're about to enter into Elul, the month of Elul, which is our preparation for the 7th month and all the big activities, the big feasts that are going to occur in the 7th month. So even though we feel this relief of having put the 9th of Av behind us, now we're back into preparation mode in terms of the Moedim, the fall Moedim, the fall feasts. So the scriptures for Re'eh are Deuteronomy 11:26 through 16:17. The Haftorah is Isaiah 54:11 through 55:5. And the Psalm is 97. And it's amazing, by the way. You'll definitely want to read the Psalm when you get a chance this week to see how the themes match up. Okay, so I want to tell you a story tonight. We'll start out with a story. Let me go ahead and go full screen. Oh, that color's pretty. So I want to tell you a true story. It's not a parable, even though Henny Penny, I think, was a story. She wasn't real. This is a real story about real chickens. And there's a picture of some of the real chickens in the story. Some of you remember me talking about our next door neighbors and how we had to take care of their chickens and ducks and sheep and goat. And by the way, their goat did make it back over the fence last week, and he does enjoy green beans. At any rate, we got to know the chickens when we were babysitting for our neighbors. And in the picture, you can see different colors of chickens. You can see red chickens, you can see a black chicken, and you can see a little white chicken. You can barely see her in the background. And she was a different breed of chicken. I don't know my chicken breeds very well. The only ones I know are bantams, and then I think the leghorns are the ones I'm familiar with, or the ones that I grew up with. And so they have different kinds of chickens. And this little white chicken was the only one out of the entire flock that had this big puffy white crest that stuck up. And so her nickname, because you had to count them, you know, when they came in at night, and you closed the gate behind them so that they would be safe from the foxes and weasels and all those sorts of things. You had to count them, and if you weren't really sure who was missing, you could figure out, well, there's this many black chickens and this many red chickens, but there was only one white chicken. And her nickname was Billie Idol because of that spiky hairdo that she had. And Billie Idol was pretty independent. There was Billie Idol, and there was a little red hen that I named Henny Penny. And Henny Penny was very friendly. She would come up and even eat out of my hand. And then she tried to peck the stone out of my mom's wedding ring that I was wearing, and that was the end of hand feeding Henny Penny. But those 2 chickens were pretty adventurous. You know, they're free-range chickens, and as it turned out, Henny Penny and Billie were long-range chickens because they routinely came over to visit our house. And they would come over and they would eat bugs in our garden, which really didn't bother us that much. But because they lived next door to us, I think they felt just fine, you know, slipping under the fence and exploring our property as well and eating bugs over here. But it worried us a little bit because it seemed like they were getting farther and farther back toward the back of the property line. And there is a game trail that follows the fence that goes all the way to the back of our property, and it's between us and our neighbor. And we'd try to shoo them back home, but it seemed like these two, the little red one and Billie, that always figure out a way to get back. And you know, you can't blame them. If you're hunting for bugs, you don't necessarily want all the competition. And they were just determined. And at any rate, they just kept going farther and farther down that old game trail. And at the end of that game trail, at the end of our property, is an old deadfall. And if you don't know what a deadfall is, it's just where a lot of trees and brush and old stuff has fallen over. And so it's just a big pile of rubbish, basically. And there's a little entrance back there. If you follow the game trail, you'll see a little hole going into the deadfall. And in the deadfall lives a pair of foxes. And before we tore down our old barn and built the new building out there, there were some nights when I would go out there at night and flip on the light to check on my horse, I would see the foxes in the back of the barn playing, just like, you know, puppies play. And so at any rate, I guess when, you know, the barn moved, the fox family continued on. And so there's this little game trail that we assume the foxes used, possibly the deer. The deer crossed through there too. But last Thursday night, Henny Penny and Billie Idol went missing. They didn't come home to roost. And so our neighbors texted us the next day, have you seen Billie Idol? Have you seen the little red hen? And we hadn't. And so we walked the property, or I did, I walked around. Alan walked around on this side, and we couldn't find Billie Idol and we couldn't find Henny Penny. But I did find some feathers back on the game trail. And so we assume that Mr. and Mrs. Fox had winter chicken dinner last Thursday night. So what's the moral of the story? Well, I think the moral of the story is Billie and Penny confused the term free range with no boundaries, which brings us to the Torah. We know that the Apostle James calls Torah that perfect Torah of liberty. But we have to understand that liberty and the life that goes in it, the pursuit of happiness, these things will occur within the boundary of liberty, not outside of it. And especially as Americans, we're a country, we're founded on some very good things, but we're also founded on rebellion. That's how we got our start. And so recognizing that that's almost intrinsic within the American mindset, it's sometimes hard to see that freedom is within boundaries. And I don't think the framers of our Constitution envisioned it any other way. They didn't see it as anarchy or just pure rebellion. But there had to be at least a nugget of rebellion in order for them to make the sacrifices that they made to form a new nation. And so in some sense, we can see why the Hebrew name Miriam, within that Hebrew word Miriam, you get a sense of bitterness, but there's also an aspect of the definition that is rebellion. And you think, well, why is that such a popular name in the Bible? I mean, there's a Mary around every corner in the New Testament. But Miriam in a positive sense, if you will take that nugget of rebellion, when you are fighting against evil, when you are fighting against unjust boundaries, then if you don't have that little nugget of rebellion within you to rebel against wickedness, to rebel against evil, then little by little you will settle for the wickedness that surrounds you. And so in that sense, we all need that little nugget of rebellion to even be where we are right now, because most of us are not working within the boundaries that we were born with. We might have been born within the boundary of a specific denomination, and somehow we looked into the word and rebelliously we broke out of that denominational boundary. But it was a good rebellion because it led to growth, it led to life, it led to liberty within the word, not outside the word. And so our freedom, if we think of the perfect Torah of liberty, let's think also of the Garden of Eden. The Garden of Eden had a boundary, and its boundaries were the rivers. The rivers of Eden, not only did they give drink to the garden, they also provided boundaries. And in the Song of Songs, which is a parable of the resurrection, by the way, Eden is referred to in chapter 4, verse 12, as a locked garden. In other words, you can't go into the garden with death because only life is permitted there. And so if you were to venture outside of that boundary, in a way, you lose your life. You lose the key. You can't get back into the sealed or into the locked garden if you're in the realm of death. There has to be intervention in order for you to have the key. You know, and of course for us, we believe that the key for us was the salvation of Yeshua. But there's also the question of what will our reward or what will our inheritance be once we attain the garden, once we are able to cross back into that locked garden, back into the realm of life. What if there's still a whole lot of rebellious death sticking to us? How is that handled? Well, I think in this Torah portion, Moses is teaching the Israelites about this transition. He's telling them, yes, you were saved. You didn't have to do a whole lot of work for that to be accomplished for you. You put some blood on the doorpost, you sacrificed a lamb. You had to have the faith that you would be saved. But now that we're out here in the wilderness, the step that you've had trouble with is transformation. How has that faith transformed you? Are you ready to make the transition between Egypt and the Promised Land? And so, of course, we can see in hindsight, of course they weren't ready. Of course they didn't really make the transition. With only a couple of exceptions, they weren't ready to transition from the realm of death into a locked garden of life. And so now they stand with Moses on the verge of crossing into the Promised Land, but likely not with the full vision of it, because they are going to experience the land. Even though there's going to be lots of miracles there, it's still going to be very much a natural place. They're not going to be able to move at will into a spirit realm and the natural realm like Yeshua did. Nevertheless, even entering into the land of Israel, they're about to take on a huge responsibility. And the Torah portion sums up for us some of those responsibilities that they're about to take upon themselves. It's no longer going to be Moses looking over their shoulders and giving them the baby steps, at every camp in the wilderness. Now that they've had time to learn, they're going to take on their own shoulders some responsibilities. And one of the important things that maybe we overlook sometimes, he's just mad because she's in his chair. They're about to take on the responsibility of kosher slaughtering their own meat. Up to this point in the wilderness, if they wanted to eat meat, then they brought in a sacrificial offering to the tent of meeting, and they ate from those portions. However, when you brought a sacrifice, if we're looking, at the Todah, the peace offering, those offerings are going to be shared with other people. And so now it's not going to be under the supervision of the priests. It's going to be under their own supervision. At some point, Moses taught them how to kosher slaughter their own animals. So really all we're given a couple of contexts in Leviticus, and then again in this Torah portion, Re'eh, it reiterates what was already written in Leviticus. It tells us what the categories of animals are that we can call food. Anything that doesn't fit within that kosher category is not considered food at all. It's something else. It's something you can feed to dogs. It's something that you can give to a Gentile. But for a holy people who will worship in Jerusalem at their Moedim, who will have that covenant identity, they no longer put it over in the food category. What we're really not told within the text, we're given the list of animals. So we can say, okay, this is clean, this is not clean, this is clean, this is not clean. What we don't get is what Moses would have had to have taught them in a more hands-on application. And that is the procedure for kosher slaughtering an animal, to make sure that it's done according to the word, even when we don't have that specific step-by-step. And if you've ever read up on those rules of kosher slaughter, they're very strict in terms of not causing distress to the animal, making sure that the blade itself doesn't even have microscopic nicks in it so that it won't tear the animal instead of cut the animal. You can go to YouTube if blood doesn't just gross you out really badly, and you can do a search on kosher slaughter and see some examples of how that's done. Now, if you're not into blood and so forth, I wouldn't recommend it. But if that process interests you, you can watch it, and you can see how quickly the animal succumbs to a kosher slaughter. Because by the time that you see that animal start twitching, once the cut has been made, there will be around 10 seconds, if we're talking about a sheep or a goat. If you count around 10 seconds, you'll start to see kind of a trembling or a tremor in the animal that you think are the death throes, but it's already dead at that point. That's just a reaction that's moving through the rest of the body. It's already gone. So seeing the tremor or the shaking of the animal, it tells you not that it's suffering or that it's in the process of dying. It tells you that it's already gone. And so it is. It's very quick. So this is a huge responsibility. If the food that you're consuming, let's say every time you wanted to have a hamburger at home, or you wanted to grill steaks, or you wanted to make fried chicken at home, if you had to, or someone in your family had to transact that process personally, you would have to know the technique. You would have to know how to do that according to the Torah. And so with that freedom to be able to slaughter meat in all their towns, they also received the obligation to do it properly. And that's the way life works. When you obtain a freedom, at the very same time you obtain an obligation. And so taking on that freedom and also taking on that obligation is an opportunity for transformation. And Moses is trying to explain this to them. And he gives the rationale for it. He says it would be too difficult if once you moved into your tribal territories, if you did want to have a goat barbecue, it would be too difficult for you to carry that goat all the way to Jerusalem, slaughter it there, and then carry, the goat meat back home just to have a nice roast goat. And so he's removing that burden from them. Again, he's making things easier, but he's also making them more difficult. He's giving them the opportunity. Now, see, up to this point, remember, if you slaughtered an animal, then it was part of the tent of meeting ritual day. And therefore, everybody's watching. Of course, you're going to give out portions because everybody's watching. You're right there in the center of the camp. You can't hide. Now that they're being, sent out into their own tribal territory, you could theoretically slaughter a lamb, slaughter a goat, not tell anybody, and keep all the meat to yourself. But what has Moses been doing for 40 years? He's been teaching them how to be a community. And so for 40 years, if they wanted to eat meat, they brought that sheep or that goat and they shared the portions until it became part of their culture even, not just a religious obligation. But when you do something often enough, at some point, you almost lose track of where obedience to the commandment ends and just what you naturally do as part of your family culture, your community culture, and so forth, those expectations, where those begin. And so having inculcated in them this obligation to share portions with others, and it might be the priest, might be the Levite, might be your family that comes to worship with you. It might be the stranger, alien, orphan, widow at a time like Sukkot. The idea is you didn't hoard up the meat and put it in the freezer for a later date. When you slaughtered the animal, it was completely consumed. And so many commandments now that Moses has been teaching them, and they had no application, no practical application to them, because they didn't have the choice of slaughtering their own animals for their own consumption in their own tents in the wilderness. But they learned about it. They didn't have fields in the wilderness in order to calculate their tithes. They didn't have fields in order to determine the corners that they were supposed to leave for the poor. And so now they're going to take it from just an idea, information that they're learning, and now they're moving into the application stage. He's saying, okay, you've learned for 40 years about the corners. You've learned for 40 years about the tithes. Now you're going to be given the real opportunity. And we're going to find out what's in your heart. We're going to find out if when you slaughter your animals, you'll share the portions. We're going to find out that when you harvest a field, how big your corners are. Because the Torah, just like the slaughter of the animal, the Torah does not define the size of a corner. And so if you own the field, it's entirely up to you whether you leave large corners for the poor to glean from, or whether you make them barely there so that it's not even worth their trouble to walk over there to look for the corner. And so these are freedoms now, because it's not as though a Levite or a priest is going to personally come to your threshing floor and count as you thresh out the seed in order to collect the tithe. It's up to you to supervise that process now. So you can cheat if you want to. It's up to you to give out the portions. There's not going to be anybody standing by counting the pieces of meat and where they go. So again, with the freedom, now comes the obligation to be transformed by the information. And sometimes I think that's where we have a disconnect. Because when we were called, in this generation uniquely, we were called from places where we have been scattered. We're reading examples, especially as part of the wilderness journey, of a people who have already been gathered. And therefore, it's very easy to visualize them worshiping at the Mishkan, bringing their sacrifices to the Mishkan, handing out those portions at the Mishkan. But for people like us who are scattered here, there, and everywhere, we have been dropped into a situation where, no, we don't have a Mishkan and we don't have a Mikdash. We don't have a temple. Most of us don't live in the land of Israel. And even if we did, there's no temple. There's no functioning priesthood or clan of Levites. We're in a place where we have so much freedom. As we learn the Torah, as we're being transformed by the information that we read, there are yet challenges we have not met because we were called scattered already. And we weren't necessarily sent out to the places where we were scattered, where we find ourselves, wherever we live right now. It's not as though Moses taught us for 40 years and then sent us out. Now, we've had Bibles, but we haven't had the type of teaching that Moses was doing for 40 years in the wilderness. And so we're in an almost reverse situation. We have all this freedom, not nearly the obligations that Moses is about to send the Israelites out to. And so many times we find ourselves stumbling and bumbling about, trying to differentiate even between a commandment we can do where we are and a commandment we cannot do where we are. And how to remember even the commandments that we can't do, but they're not yet an obligation. Our only obligation is to learn them and to guard them for when we can go into the land. Nevertheless, there's a test here. If we can be responsible with this little bit of obligation that he has given us where we've been scattered, if we can be responsible for that, and with that, then possibly we can be prepared to be gathered for further instruction. And that's the difficulty, because right now we are a nation scattered among nations, and for the most part, we're little rebels against the systems that we were brought up in. And that little bit of rebellion that we had to have in us in order to overthrow allegiance to systems that just simply aren't working, to systems that are not truly founded upon the scripture, but are deviations from the scripture, misunderstandings of the scripture, ignorance of the scripture. We have to have that little bit of rebellion to get out of there. And then we get out of there, and what we realize is, you know what, as much as I talk about boundaries and limitations in the Torah, I've got so much freedom, I don't know what to do with myself right now. And so there's certain freedoms that we're enjoying right now that we're not going to have. If we were to go into the locked garden, we're still doing certain things, certain practices, even though we like to pride ourselves on having rejected idolatry. I would venture to guess there's still idolatry in our lives in some way that maybe we don't even know is idolatry. And so out here in this land of freedom, our experience is different than it will be once we move into the garden. However, it's our job to rehearse and be responsible with our freedom out here so that we can be trusted with the freedom that will come there. And so if we can't be trusted here to share a portion, then I don't know if we're ready to be trusted in the locked garden to share our portions. If we can't be trusted to be generous with our corners with this freedom that we have here, then how can we be trusted to be generous with our corners there? If we're completely disregarding clean eating here, then how can we be trusted to differentiate it between the clean and the unclean there? And so that tells us we got a lot of work to do in order to become responsible living within the freedom that we have. And recognizing that the freedom that we have is entirely within a boundary of the word. The rehearsal in the wilderness gave them time to build a sense of community so that when they entered the land of Israel, they would continue with that sense of community. They wouldn't just fracture off into 12 tribes that never communicated, that never worshiped together, that didn't have the shared values and culture of the Bible. The idea was that, okay, now I'm sending you out. You're completely disconnected and free from one another. No, he spent 40 years teaching them how to connect, because the Holy One insisted that they bring the animals they intended to slaughter to the tent of meeting, which was called, it had other names, it was also called the Ohel Moed, the tent of meeting. And you've heard the word Moed before because you know of the Moedim, the feasts. And so when you slaughtered your animal, it gave you that sense of community that goes with attending a feast. Same thing happens when you go to the grocery store, if that's where you buy your food. Then as you go up and down each aisle, typically, if I were to just follow you around, you'd know I was following you. If I were to follow you around, I would probably notice on some things you just throw it in the buggy. With other items, you would pick the item up, you would look on the front at the label, and if you didn't see what you were looking for, you'd flip it on the back to see if there was something on the back label. And the casual observer might not even know what you were doing. They might think you were looking for nutritional information. but you have a shared sense of community. And so if I knew who you were, I would know what you were looking for. You were looking for a symbol that this food is kosher, it's been inspected, it's been approved, that it's fit for food, not dogs. You might be looking at the list of ingredients. If you don't see a symbol, you might be scanning through the list of ingredients and saying, well, what's actually in there? That it doesn't have the label on it, that it doesn't have the kosher symbol on it. Or you might have picked it up and said, I'm not familiar with that symbol. At any rate, you have a shared sense in your eating when you do that. Every time you go to the store and you check the labels, or you go through that mental process before you put the food item in your grocery cart, you are sharing something with every other believer who eats the way that you do. And so no matter where they are in the world, if they're going through that same process, then you're a little nation. No matter how scattered you are from one another, you have a sense of community. Moses built this by having them all gather together. We're having to learn this scattered out, and it's not easy, because it seems like, when somebody new comes in and they're like, well, how do I know? I didn't realize gelatin was made out of pigs. I didn't realize Jiffy Mix had pigs in it, unless it was vegetarian. And there's this whole volume of information that we have, that we acquire in our quest for kosher eating, that a new person doesn't know yet. And then, because we're all scattered around and we don't truly have a sense of community, we'll all give them different advice. And so you'll have people arguing over kosher symbols and things like this. And that's not profitable. It's not profitable. It's simply confusing. But here's the good news out of all that. The problem only comes up because we're trying to obey. It doesn't come up because we're trying to disobey. So on the disagreement scale, that's a great disagreement to have. If we're disagreeing over how valid a kosher symbol is, or what process malto meal went through, that some of the boxes are kosher and some of the boxes aren't. That's okay. Right? As long as it doesn't just completely consume you, those are questions that can come up. Are marshmallows kosher? For the most part, no. But more and more, as your vision improves and as your friends help you, you can identify those brands of marshmallows that are kosher, that don't have pigs in them. And that's how we're building community in spite of the obstacle of not being in a community, a physical community. That kind of overcoming, if you think about it, is even more difficult than what they had in the wilderness. Because there they had Moses. There they had judges, leaders, who could take the information from Moses and pass it on and say, this is how you slaughter an animal. Who could give them the specifics. They could bring their animal to the tent of meeting, and there would be qualified priests and Levites there to guide them through that process. And so as we're building community, as we're scattered all over the place, yes, we're going to get some things wrong. But what needs to be right is the transformation that this obedience is bringing into our lives. For instance, if you do a little historical research, you'll find that even into the 1900s, which is fairly recent in time, that the Assyrian Christians in the Middle East, like Iraq, what we would say is modern Iran, and likely these Assyrian Christians were descendants of the 10 lost tribes, because where they popped up was exactly where the lost tribes were lost, according to the prophets. And so most likely a great number of these Assyrian Christians were descendants of the 10 lost tribes. And so as part of their culture and even their religion, which was Christian in the 1900s. I mean, these were the, descendants of some of the earliest apostles' work. Like Thomas went into that area and he preached and made converts there. So they have a very old, rich heritage of Christianity that's very different from Western Christianity. So in their culture and in the way that they read scripture, when a family would slaughter an animal, they first sent a portion to their local preacher or priest, and then they would send portions to family members and neighbors. And if they didn't do that, it was considered a severe breach of ethics. If we look into Jewish culture, the Persian Jewish families, other Middle Eastern Jewish families, one thing that they did that wasn't necessarily retained by the European Jews, but the Middle Eastern Jews, the fathers would pass along the knowledge of kosher slaughter to their sons. And this continued well into the 1900s. And for some of them, it didn't really stop until they immigrated to places like Israel or the United States or Great Britain. But up until that time, Middle Eastern Jews knew that it was an important mitzvah for them to be able to kosher slaughter their animals no matter where they lived. And even when they had kosher butchers in places like Iran, it was still a father's responsibility to teach it to his sons. And, not to do so was considered a pretty severe breach. That was the expectation. And so what do we see? They retained within their families something that Moses planted in them for 40 years in the wilderness. Share your portions when you slaughter an animal. And you might say, well, that's because they didn't have freezers and refrigerators. They had to get rid of it or it would ruin. Yes and yes. Gam v'gam, right? Yes, that's true. However, it's specified in the Torah that you give portions, that this is part of rejoicing, especially at the feast times, to give portions. What did King David do when he had a celebration? He would send the people away with portions. Sharing food is an important part of our feasting. It's an important part of the Moedim. And the Israelites learned this at the Ohel Moed, where they learned how to share their portions. And so this was where, the mitzvah bled over into the culture. You did it sometimes, I'm sure, especially as it was passed down to the Assyrian Christians. At some point, it became embedded into their culture as much as their religion. So we want to look at some topics that are in this Torah portion and try to tie all this together. We want to show a relationship, because eventually we want to think about Billy Idol and what led Billy Idol to become winner, winner, chicken dinner. We're contrasting this, let me go explore on my own attitude because this is interesting and it's on the other side of the fence. And, you know, it's not something I can do on my side of the fence, but it's on the other side of the fence. And the bugs are real good here. And so that sense of disconnection from the other chickens eventually led to Billy Idol and Henny Penny's demise. Had they stayed with the other chickens on their side of the fence, they would probably be in the chicken coop tonight. But they're not in the chicken coop tonight. They're probably not even still in the fox tonight. And that's how fast the world moves when we get caught up in something. And so we want to look at how these topics are placed in the Torah portion together. The fact, not necessarily the order of their appearance, but the fact that these topics appear together, I think, are teaching us the Billy Idol principle, because it shows how disconnecting from community leads so easily to idolatry. And somehow that's all still wrapped up in kosher animals and slaughtering meat. So I made some bullet points here. The Torah portion gives us a recap of the 3 foot festivals. They're called Chagim. It's going to be Pesach, Shavuot, and Sukkot. In fact, the Torah portion will end with these 3. And even though the place has not yet been conquered or built up, we know that later that place was Jerusalem. And so there's a review of how you need to bring the tithes up to Jerusalem, that this is going to be part of the 3 feasts, is going to be sharing again the food, not just the animal sacrifices, but, you know, eating the tithes is part of it, so that you can include portions for the stranger, the alien, the orphan, and the widow. Also in the portion, it talks about how they must thoroughly destroy the idols and the idolaters, even if it's your father, even if it's your son, even if it's a close family member. If they are a willful idolater within the land of Israel, then you have to destroy that person. There's a process. There's a case to be heard. And if that case is made and they're guilty, then they have to be destroyed. Why? Because the physical land of Israel represents what we expect to inherit in the garden at the resurrection. And so if we cannot refrain from idolatry in the land of Israel now, how can we possibly hope to maintain the Shema that we're given in this last Torah portion? How can we expect to maintain that acknowledgement of the unity and the power of Elohim in the garden? We're rehearsing the same way that the Israelites rehearsed in the wilderness to enter into the land where we are scattered. We are also rehearsing to enter into the land, to enter into the garden. It gives us instructions for slaughtering meat for personal consumption rather than sacrifices. Now, if you have a sacrifice, you still have to bring it up to Jerusalem. But the difference is now you can just slaughter meat for personal consumption that's not part of your tithe. It's not set apart for, say, a Nazarite vow. It hasn't been designated as one of the holies. And it reiterates the list of kosher animals that would qualify as food, whether it's food for the sacrificial altar or whether it's food for your home. And in that, it also lists the Shemitah, the 7th year release of the indentured Hebrew servant, and how he has to be released with his wife and children so that they can return to their own inheritance in the land of Israel. And if you were just to take those 4 bullet points and go through the Torah portion and look at how much real estate those topics occupy along with their little subsets. There's going to be little spin-offs from each of those, more details from each of those. If you count up that real estate, you realize it's a major player in the portion. So there must be something that ties them together. So it's, in terms of topics, how to eat kosher, that's not that hard. It's not even hard to acquire a fundamental understanding of the feast. Now, I think we'll keep on learning into eternity, but just at a basic acquiring of the difference between a clean and unclean animal and what's food and what isn't, not that difficult. In fact, it was one of the big four given in Acts 15. I said, don't eat things strangled. Well, that word in Hebrews, Harper's Bible Dictionary defines things strangled as things that are not rabbinically slaughtered. Well, rabbis don't slaughter anything that's not kosher. And so the Gentiles were even given kosher eating to start out with. So it couldn't have been that hard. That's what James and the Jerusalem Council said. Like, we don't want to make it too difficult for them. So we can't run around saying kosher eating is difficult, because the Jerusalem Council said it wasn't. It's in the Torah. It's not that difficult. It is written. Now, there's little details we can learn. It's not even hard to acquire an understanding of the 7 feasts. But out of those topics, what's the most difficult thing for us in 2020 to comprehend? And idolatry, if we think of like when we're reading the 10 Commandments, when we look at idolatry, it's so easy to flip through that one and say, well, I don't have a problem with that, and go on to the next one. It's, I think, because we tend to see it only in the context of carved images. I think we see it somehow only in the context of formed idols like the Bible talks about. And typically we don't hang out with people who mold or carve idols and then worship them as gods. Now, you might walk in on something like I did at the donut place where they had a little idol set up. You know, if you have people from other cultures, you might run into that. But as a normal thing where we live, there's just not a lot of carved images that people are sincerely prostrating themselves to and praying to and worshiping and sacrificing children to. In fact, some people have pretty crazy college days, and if somebody today advertised a Baal and Asherah or a Molech party, there'd probably be some idiots who showed up, but probably not our group. All right. If somebody just advertised there, we're having a party for Asherah, come on over, you just don't see that often. So whatever this idolatry is to people of faith today, it's probably way more subtle than that. It's so subtle that we may not be identifying it properly. Somehow, maybe it would have been easier, just to say, well, don't have you a little fertility goddess in your house. Don't take your child and pass it through the fire. That's very tangible. It's very real. I think idolatry in our generation is much more subtle than that, to the point that we don't realize it's happening, but it's definitely happening. If we look at the original example of idolatry, it doesn't really have a carved image. It doesn't have, now it does have a tree, and it does involve a beast. And if you look at carved images, typically they have some type of human form or beast form. So we have the essential elements in the garden, but Eve didn't chop the tree down and carve it into a serpent. The experience was much more, I think, relevant to our day and time. It was a situation. That's what the idolatry was in the garden. It was a situation that developed. And in hindsight, we can look back at that situation and say, well, Adam and Eve should have seen that coming, which that's the title of the Torah portion, right? See. We need to see these things coming. And so if they're in a garden locked, that means that, of course, their job is to work the garden and to guard it. But somehow the serpent managed to get into the locked garden, and he issued an invitation. And when we fail to guard the garden, we tend to lock ourselves out of the house, which is, where we find our inheritance. It doesn't necessarily mean that we've lost our salvation, but there is something beyond salvation, and that is your inheritance. Just like there was something beyond Egypt, and that was the land of Israel. And that's our inheritance, and that's the inheritance we want for our children. That's the Hebrew indentured servant. He doesn't want to stay in the master's house forever, and he's not even allowed to. He might stay in there, but at the year of Jubilee, in the 50th year, he's got to go. Even if he wants to stay with that master, got to go. You have to go back to your inheritance. And so that's what we want for ourselves. We want our inheritance in the garden, and we want that for our children and our children's children. But when we fail to guard these mitzvot, when we fail to guard these areas where we are now, it really does keep us in a certain type of debt to sin. The books aren't balancing at that point. And so, having been saved, the craziest thing we could do is keep borrowing out of that sin account. We were set free from it. Just like, why would you go back to Egypt? You've been set free from Egypt. Why would you keep asking to go back to Egypt? Why do you want to stay in debt that way? Why do you want to be chained? Why do you want to make payments that you don't have to make? Because when we continue sinning, having come to the knowledge of the truth, then most likely we're going to have the consequences of that sin. In the same way that if you get into debt in real life, there's consequences. In the same way, if you go back in debt to sin that you were delivered from, there's going to be consequences. And so having that freedom of our salvation brings with it an obligation not to go back into sin. It brings with it an obligation to apply the things we've learned within that newfound freedom that we have. So, how can we identify idolatry today? Well, idolatry and sorcery are going to be mentioned all the way from Genesis to Revelation in some form. It's so egregious because it runs counter to our greatest commandment, Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad, recognizing the oneness of Adonai, his power. He alone is God. There are gods with a small g, which it's Elohim. There is Elohim, our creator, but then there are also Elohim, which can translate out to judges. And we know that he has put angels as ministering angels that have particular dominions who execute his commandments. Like we see that in the book of Daniel, that specific angels might make war or they might protect a certain area. Nevertheless, they are not God. They are not Yod He Vav He. He is the only one. The rest of them are created beings. And so if our greatest commandment is that the Father is one, then we have to recognize what great personal danger we're in if we make more than one God. And that's going to be the question we want to deal with tomorrow. How can we today move past this mental assent? There's no one sitting here who would ever disagree with Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad, unless you wanted to correct my pronunciation of the name. The principle you would not disagree with. Yes, he is one. He is all powerful. There is none like him. There is none other than him. But see, if idolatry weren't such a thing, it wouldn't keep popping up all the way to Revelation. Therefore, we must in some way still be vulnerable to idolatry. And if we're still vulnerable to idolatry, we'd best figure out what it is. Personally. When it works in a subtle way, like it did in the garden. And where we'll be going tomorrow, just to give you an overview, I want to take you back to this passage that we studied before. And it truly describes, I think, what this Torah portion is teaching us. And it comes from 1 Kings 21:1. And remember, the story behind the story here is that Ahab looks out and he sees that this man named Naboth has a vineyard adjacent to the palace. And Ahab covets this vineyard. And the man won't sell the vineyard to him. So Ahab's wife Jezebel has him killed. And like, okay, here, happy birthday, here's your vineyard. And so it says, now it came about after these things that Naboth, his name means fruits, the Jezreelite, had a vineyard, which was in Jezreel, beside the palace of Ahab, king of Samaria. Ahab spoke to Naboth, saying, give me your vineyard, that I may have it for a vegetable garden, because it is close beside my house. And I will give you a better vineyard than it in its place. If you like, I will give you the price of it in money. But Naboth said to Ahab, the Lord forbid that I should give you the inheritance of my fathers. All right, so tomorrow we're going to go over. We're going to look for the idolatry, the identifying characteristic of what the way that the idolatry is liable to be introduced into our lives. And the way that it's going to be introduced to us is the same way that it was introduced in the garden. And just as Ahab and Jezebel are known as like idolaters of idolaters in the history of the Israelite kings, Israelite royalty, we can see right here what made him tick. And it's convenience. You see, the vineyard was beside his palace. Where did Billie Idol meet her maker? And the fox beside her palace. She had an appointed place. She was a free-range chicken, and she turned into a long-range chicken. But see, the properties are side by side. So she was just ducking under the fence. And so it's likely that when you're enticed to a place of idolatry, it's going to be because it's very close to where you are, to where your palace is, to where your strength is, to where your domain is. And then it kind of repeats it. So it stands out. Ahab gives the rationale for wanting that vineyard. And tomorrow we'll unpack vegetable garden. What does that actually say in Hebrew? But here's why he wants it. He says, I want this vineyard because it's close beside my house. Okay, we're told two different ways that this murder is going to take place because it's close to Ahab's house. It's close to his domain. And that makes sense because if you think of a vegetable garden where you're going to grow green things for the king's table, where he's going to have to supply food to his court, if you've ever been in a Middle Eastern country, you know how fast the vegetables are going to wilt in that sun. And it's not like you could throw them on the produce refrigerated truck. You put them in donkey carts and ox carts. And by the time you bring the vegetables from the fields and you get it into the palace, it's not looking its best. It's not fresh. It's not crisp. It's not as bright and full of color. And so if you can get that vegetable garden right beside your house, then you pretty much have the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And that's what it says in Genesis 3:6. When the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was a delight to the eyes, and that the tree was desirable to make one wise, she took from its fruit and ate, and she gave also to her husband with her, and he ate. And so right off the tree, you get the fruit, or right out of the ground, you get the vegetable that's juicier, sweeter, crisper, brighter. It's fresh when it hits the table. Convenience. That's what caught Ahab's eye. That's what he saw. Remember, Re'eh, see. What did he see? He saw it was close to his palace. It was adjacent to his property. It would be so much cheaper if he could have this vegetable garden next to his court. And I think this is how idolatry gets our attention, even in 2020. It's going to be something adjacent to us, and we're going to look at it, and we're going to think it's appetizing, it's delightful, it's beautiful to look at. Maybe it'll make us smarter, but it's going to be very easy to access it, because this goes back to the instruction in the Torah portion. Because we don't get the impression that Eve, went on a long journey, that she took the fruit, packed it in a basket, picnic basket, went on this long journey to the edge of the garden. No, it just says she took it and ate it. Then she handed it to Adam and he ate it. It was convenient. And so the prohibition in our Torah portion in Deuteronomy 12:12 is, you're not supposed to be worshiping idols under every green tree. And we know that trees are metaphors of human beings in Scripture. And this particular tree appeared to have a desirable form of life in it. It looked green. It reflected exactly what they desired. It would taste good. It was beautiful. It would make them smart. And that's the way advertisements today are driven. They're trying to appeal to us by selling us all these concoctions and treatments that are supposed to make us beautiful, smart, and will please our palates. Now, you can have it with express shipping. You can have it overnight. You can drop 20 pounds in a month. Everything that is probably most likely to become an idol in our life is going to be something of convenience and easy to reach. And so tomorrow we'll tie that together. How the idolatry on the mountains, on the hills, and under every green tree is going to be associated not just with idolatry, but the way that we allow ourselves to cross that boundary and think it's freedom, to misunderstand what the freedom is for. The freedom is so that we will internalize, that we will have been transformed by the word. And even with all that freedom, we will continue to give out portions to others. We will continue to enlarge our corners. We will continue to do good to the stranger, the alien, the orphan, and the widow. That in the process of doing the commandments, that we will also be transformed by them, rather than doing what is most convenient to us. So we'll stop there for now.